Hi, good morning. My name is Prasad Shetty, and would like to welcome all of you to the third annual conference of the School of Environment and Architecture. I work at the School of Environment and Architecture, and we've been doing this now. This is the third year of doing this conference. In 2020, when we started, the pandemic was just kind of setting in. And last year we were right in the middle of the pandemic, really, and and last year we shifted completely online. This year, hopefully, we are at the end of the pandemic, hopefully. And most of us from C are in school. Though this is an online conference today, but most of us are within the premises of C here in Bombay. The pandemic actually did not like it was very difficult to make sense of what was happening while the pandemic was going on, and through series of initiatives, we started finding ways to kind of thinking about it. So COVID Glossary, which was a project, which was the project of C, was essentially trying to make sense of the pandemic through collecting stories of how people were living through the pandemic. So there are some 400 stories, and there is a website, and there is an exhibition, and all of those things. But today is also, we're speaking in the background of another thing which is not making sense, the war, and we again today there is no we don't have clear registers to kind of make sense as to why we as humanity kind of do these things actually. And I think this war will not take so long. It will. I hope it kind of ends very soon. And but again, like the pandemic, the world would have shifted a little bit. So that shifting a little bit is what is of interest to us, as to see how is that small shift, how has that small shift happened, in the world. There is there is no one can speculate on an extreme reconfiguration. For example, one can think of, for example, in the education sector, we were thinking that the idea of built form will not be there. The classroom will dissolve, and the online space will kind of take over and stuff like that. But that seems to have not happened. But there is a nudge. There is a small nudge. There is a small shift where we have kind of moved towards. How to make sense, how to engage, how to enjoy has been some of the preoccupations of C at C, and these series of conferences, annual conferences, were primarily around uh, these questions of how to make sense, how to engage, how to enjoy, etc. The metaphor of the forest is super important. Is a super important idea for us at CN. We've been thinking about it since quite some time. The forest happens through internal energies of one species, along with nudges and encounters of other species. And these energies, nudges, encounters cannot be explained or imprisoned or trapped within the moralities of humanity, which, we don't have a language to kind of speak about the forest through the terms of forest. We may call things like symbiosis, parasitic, collaborative, toxic, survival energy, etc. And in all of these, we look at the forest from our morality. We project, the civilizational moralities onto looking at the forest. For example, destruction, toxicity are all part of the forest. The forest cannot happen without destruction or toxicity. Am I trying to qualify destruction and toxicity? No, I'm not trying to qualify destruction and toxicity. But what I'm trying to say is that we have no language other than this to think through destruction and toxicity to talk. So there is that language question. But despite of all of this, the forest provides a density which is precious, which is viscerally felt. And I'm sure those who've been to forests kind of, know of what I'm speaking. It's a precious density which is viscerally felt. So this conference, or today's day, 12th of March, at sea is to kind of figure out a way to produce that density which can be viscerally felt. The density of internal energies, nudges, and encounters. And that's the spirit of this conference today. The question of seeing, engaging, enjoying, not to say that these are separate in any manner. These are all one and same, seeing, engaging, enjoying, with different tonalities of activity. Depends upon the ways, methods, and language that we employ. I mean, call something a disease and you will tend to remove it. Call it a condition, you may figure out a way to live with it, right? Or the way one looks at the idea of crime also. Look at a person as a criminal, the intervention is something. But look at the same person as ill or sick, the intervention is slightly different. I mean, this is not new. People have spoken about this quite often. In and around architecture, there have been some ossification of ways of seeing and the methods, like the mobilization of cartography and statistics to look at cities. Cities have been kind of seen through cartographies and statistics, and they provide with the instrumental logics of intervention. Mobilization of orthography to look at how to draw space, and this orthography has kind of created the space that we inhabit, our familiarity with the way we build, the way we think about buildings, the way we think about form and space. Mobilization of chemical sciences to look at environment, the question of pollution, the question of toxicity, the question of climate change. Mobilization of identity to look at habitat, to look at the question of region. In this, nation becomes important. In this, style becomes important. And mobilization of precision or utility to look at material and technology, which again kind of consolidated through the industrial processes. At sea, we've been rethinking these mobilizations, which seem to have consolidated in the past 100, 200 years or more even. The format of this conference is that of a conversation. We invite spatial practitioners who we think are close to the practices and the practitioners from C, who are thinking similarly like us. We want to have this conversation to interrogate each other, of course, but more importantly, to produce the forest and to produce this density of energies and nudgings and encounters. And that is really the idea behind bringing these people together. So there are no moderators and there are no chairpersons of this in these panels and these sessions. They're all kind of they're all presenting and they're all chatting and conversing with each other. Hopefully, we'll produce this forest of friendships, which will be a nice place to inhabit from here. Thank you, and I now welcome the first panel, Shreyank, Ashok, Ranjana, to start the first session. It's called The Forest of Urban Contradictions. Shreyank?
Hi, thanks, Prasad, and welcome everyone. Welcome Ashok, welcome Ranjana. So what we'll do is, I will start with my presentation and then I'll invite Ranjana to follow me and then Ashok will go after. I'll introduce each one of them just before their presentations, so it's easier to kind of correlate. So, hi, I'm Shreyank Khemalapure. Let me start with my presentation. So what I would like to do today is let's say if we take the provocation of the forest seriously, then I want to ask what are the grounds on which the forest really grows. And as we know, there are n number of forests, different kinds of forests, and each of them have a different kind of terrain or a ground condition on which they kind of in some sense build that wilderness. So I really want to in that sense ask that question of what are the grounds on which certain imaginations are built, particularly in the discussion of urbanism. And for that I was thinking that what are the concepts that have really held our imagination, at least if not longer, in the last 20 years, beginning of this century. So that's the scope that I will limit myself. So before I kind of get on to the presentation itself, what I want to briefly remark is that the trajectory that I'll be in a sense tracking will be to kind of say that there's a prominence in the idea of continuum, and that reading has perhaps come from a certain conceptual idea of understanding the world through the lens of thermodynamics. I don't have to have the time to qualify it, but I'll try to present it as clearly as possible. And there's a shift from that kind of understanding towards understanding of urbanism beginning from form or objects, so to speak. So before I get into that, a brief remark on ontology and today's presentation. I'm seeing this presentation more of an inter-review of concepts in the last 20 years. Besides science, I assume that, and I believe that ontologies offer among the best models to make sense of reality. They tell us how things work. Apparently, that's what Deleuze would argue. And in some sense, ontologies like concepts take very, very long time to change. In some sense, we are still in the shadows of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and Chinese, African, indigenous ontologies and epistemologies, so to speak. And concepts also do take very, very long time to develop. So in that spirit, I'm not trying to, in that sense, critique, but to kind of figure out where we are. And I'm being unfair here in picking handful of concepts and handful of urbanists, but given this, the framework of time that we have, I'm just kind of picking some of them just to see where we are at the moment. And I'll kind of try to go through each one of them and try to see or try to read continuums and discontinuums in these concepts. So starting from, let's say, this concept of everyday urbanism, where the notion of everyday becomes really important for urbanists, and close to, let's say, this decade, still kind of, the idea of ephemerality going really strong as a concept. So let me start with the first part of the presentation, which kind of explores concepts that deal with some of the other way of thinking urbanity through the lens of continuum. So let's say what really happens in the notion of everyday urbanism, right? You kind of take everyday practices as the ground of urbanity. That is the ultimate reality on which all concepts and all practices, all further ideas of urbanity are built. If you take three notions, let's say appropriation, incrementality, elasticity, here the notions of interstitial practices, neither formal nor informal, not neatly categorizable, etc., become sort of the grounds on which ideas get built. One of the key concepts here is that change by degrees or gradualism, which we will see somehow also connects to the work of Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Kuna, where they say wetness is everywhere to some degree, which is an interesting idea in itself, that where there's a claim that even the desert is not technically dry, but it is a lesser degree of wetness. So everything is in this sense and intensity, with either high or low. So there's the sense of degree of continuum that builds in this notion. But at the same time, among similar authors and similar thinkers, there has been an interesting sense of or reading of urban conditions as conditions of discontinuum, discontinuities, etc. So for instance, let's say if we even take the notion of ephemerality, and the way this study was structured was either through days, months, years, where there's either an event or a settlement, etc., is only active, so to speak, for a certain particular period of time. So there's a discontinuity in the notion of time, not necessarily in space and form, at least in this reading, so that the time factor becomes interesting as not a ever present thing, but there's a clear beginning and a clear end in this notion of reading of ephemerality. Or in the case of Solomon Benjamin, where let's say the land becomes the ground of various practices which are also related to economy, but are also read as multiple layered land as a multi-layered kind of entity with multiple claims, contestations, displacements, so on and so forth, which since at least 2008, a very interesting concept of occupancy urbanism was sketched out. Or let's say if we take the work of Bart Studio and their idea of transactional capacities, the notions of how objects really kind of nudge each other and produce in that nudging a certain urban form, which is not smooth, which is not in a sense kind of continuous in that sense, but is coarse, blurred, corroded, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the transactions or exchanges of which are kind of promoted or pushed, or let's say even afforded by the objects, becomes the ground on which the urbanity is shaped. So in the same idea, for instance, where they say that depending on the degree of the blur of the settlement, or the urban form, it either affords more transaction or less transactions, right? So and this image speaks for itself. I won't get into too much detail. Again, in Solomon Benjamin's case, where I'll skip this one, but get to this story where he says how, let's say, cultural practices, beliefs connected to land, so in his opinion, also act as disruptors of, or not necessarily disruptors, but also how these practices nudge urbanization processes. For instance, a very interesting story where he says one of the biggest developers, land developers in South Canada, repeatedly returned to the notion of South Canada as a possessed by various governing spirits. Such beliefs in sacred territory apply across religions, and even Catholics and Muslims returning from abroad have their extended families visit him to ensure that the required cleansing of land, cleansing ritual has been carried out. So the developer explained in detail how the entire territory of South Canada, possessed by spirits and protected by Nagas, was disturbed, and he narrated the mythological genealogy of that story. It's an interesting story. Whoever is interested can read the essay at their discretion. And he further goes on to explain that if Nagas are killed somewhere else, it doesn't really matter. But if such things happen in South Canada, a lot of bad things can happen to the person killing the Nagas. So what does it really mean? He says as these included accounts of how in the construction of several mega projects, the contractor or the company that was insensitive to these issues suffered huge losses. So you see how even a mythological, culturally kind of, accrued practice of Bhutakola and other things connected to the question of land really also act as kind of obstructors of the smooth process of urbanization, so to speak. So where does this all really lead us? And I'm hurrying also because of the time that we have in hand. So if we return back to the concepts again, this handful of concepts that we have picked, we see that there are two interesting trajectories that emerge, or two distinct, let's say, ways of imagining the urban emerges, conceptually at least. On the one hand, you see that there is a certain thermodynamic understanding of space, and I will try to qualify this in a bit. For where the question of everyday process, gradualism, and interstitial becomes really key ways of understanding the city. And my only critique here is that perhaps this understanding emerged at a moment, particularly after 1990s, where, let's say, the readings were primarily of big cities and the transformations that the big cities were undergoing at that moment, Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Pune, etc., where the cities really appeared to be in this kind of, a fluxy, so almost like a mega transformation moment where everything appeared unstable, everything appeared to be kind of changing very quickly and very, in a sense, rapidly. And there was a push in some sense to kind of oppose that kind of rapid change with this notion of gradualism, which is basically asking for an incremental change. But on the other hand, let's say you have readings of Solomon Benjamin, I think primarily also because the moment Solomon changes his attention to South Canada region, looking at small cities, where he starts noticing this notions of, multi-layered, multiplicities of things. And that's my reading. It could be shorthanded at the moment, but also for introducing notions of gods, desires, devil gods, and so on and so forth, the intangible, the virtual realm, where you can't really materially kind of, touch those spirits in that sense, but they can only possess you, they can speak through you, and so on and so forth. But also this notion of relationalism through the idea of affordance and transaction. And why am I calling some of it as thermodynamic? Because I'm thinking through this remark that Foucault makes just in the very first paragraph of Other Spaces, where he says that the 19th century found the quintessence of its mythological resources in the second law of thermodynamics, and this is in 1980s. And he says our own era, on the other hand, seems to be that of space. Now, regardless of whether it is precisely the second law or the first law, or regardless of whether it is about space of, read in a particular way, what one can take from this remark is that um, that there was a certain conception of how reality is actually, and then there was whether it is, let's say, Marx's kind of sketching of how eventually everything will lead towards communism, so to speak, and that eventualism kind of things leading to something, tending towards something. One can take that as things tending gradually towards something as this notion of thermodynamics. On the other hand, the reading of space, even if you take Foucault's reading of space, as one can see very clearly, there's also a kind of idea of dispositive or disposition, but it's also kind of moving from something to something. But at the same time, there's a reading of space which is also of densification and rarefication, even if we take the notion of space to be produced. And if you combine these two, it somehow looks like this. And this is the model that kind of appears of how urbanists kind of align with the thermodynamic, let's say, axis, see cities, see reality, processes, so on and so forth, like this coming together and going away in a very dynamic and continuous sense. And this is Bruno Mari in 1967. I don't have really time to kind of go through this, but Marx notices that what can be explained in detail can be spoken of general, but the reverse is not true. Or when Deleuze says that everything has to be interpreted as intensity, brings us back to this. Or Walter Benjamin, 100 years before our Benjamin, introduces the notion of cult value in sort of Marxist reading, which is a very interesting intervention, I think, where things are all, some certain things are hidden. And I think one of the best examples one can think is the last sentence of this quote, which is certain sculptures that are made in medieval cathedral at very high level of the, on the interior of the cathedral, where it's not really visible for the person who's entering at the ground level, or the gargoyles which are just, kept on top of the cathedral, which nobody ever sees. And he argues that these were all done for the eye of the god, for the certain cult value, which is interesting because it also resists clarity, it resists transparency, which are all interesting concepts that are important also for Solomon Benjamin in many ways. And in that obstructive sense of the world, it's not the Bruno Mari's dotted intensities that become really important, but one can then read cities or perhaps at the larger scale reality as this kind of loosely present imprints of objects which create a field afterwards. Not the field is not pre-given, but the field is created after the presence of various desires, imaginations, objects, and things like that. And it is the interplay of these kind of objects that really kind of one can say that one can read the city also in this way. So why is this sort of reading necessary at this moment for us? This is because since last 4 or 5 years, as a school, we are interested in looking at or studying second cities, or let's say cities that are non-metropolitan, and what is the urbanization condition there. And we didn't really have the time to reflect when we started. How did these second cities really appear to us, occur to us? And after spending, let's say, 3 years of reading second cities, so to speak, I'm taking this moment also to reflect as to how did these second cities really appear to us, and what are the concepts through which we can really think through them. And how did the second cities really appear? It really appeared as a kind of as a kind of a, if I were to borrow, a field where multiple things are happening, and then let's say multiple events are taking place, which are calling for certain shifts, clear shifts, and not necessarily a gradual shift, but a clear shift in the way the cities have been before the occurrence of these events. So let's say whether it is why does an inner city in a particular small city is transforming, how does the remittance from Southeast Asia, Middle East, transforming the housing desires in places like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and so on and so forth. A certain section of population wanting to retire in a particular location because it is favorable for their cultural, let's say, affinities, or because the climate is suitable or the weather is more convenient, and a bunch of students trying to move to these cities because there are new universities, coaching classes, and so on and so forth are being established in these cities. So you see that the cities don't really present themselves as influx for the sake of influx, but because there is an event, there is a clear change, a clear moment that is asking for that change to occur, for that shift to occur. And in some sense, it kind of appears like a complex system, if one may to say, in this manner. Not this diagram is not updated, but let's say in spirit, it is how it might appear, a kind of bunch of objects trying to connect with one another and not connect with the other things. So there's a kind of clear affinities there. So why think of discontinuities? No, like in the sense, like if you look at this image where again, this is an inner city condition in a city like Trichy, you see this old man, that young boy, this old house, that new chawl in the background, the new bricks in the foreground. And you see that it is not necessarily a continuum, but it is a clear shift, which is basically, so to speak, a shift between a thatch roof condition to, let's say, if not an RCC construction and a GI sheet roof, or whatever you want to call it. So there's a clear shift, and it is not a gradual shift in that sense. Perhaps this house in the foreground took 100 years to be as it is, and that house behind it kind of took 5 years or something. It's not a gradual as it appears. Or the case of senior citizens, where let's say either because the popular story is being either because the children have moved to another country, another city, nobody's there to take care of them. So these developers, and there are many institutions besides the developers, have picked one, who kind of are harping on this moment where there's a desire from a certain section of society, particularly middle class, upper middle class, to kind of find a sort of a haven, so to speak, for their retired life. This is how it might appear on a day-to-day basis. A retired person trying to spend time playing carom or foosball in a building like this, perhaps. And if I may conclude without taking much time, how might one we add to that list of concepts that we kind of started with? What might we kind of really add? So let's say if I take that quote by Deleuze and the drawing by Bruno Munari very seriously, as there's an atomistic reading that becomes very clear. So that I'll keep it towards the thermodynamic side. On the side of the form, perhaps also to read other cities as well, but these are the readings that emerge from second cities. We can probably start thinking through the idea of groups or compounds, not necessarily atoms. The concept of everyday becomes important, continues to become important, but it is not necessarily everyday unaffected by other things, but an everyday that is responding to an event. The scale of the event, number of events could vary. It's not a continual process, but it is rather a responsive, discontinual process. You can think of all those small industrial clusters that either had to shut down or shift because of China, for instance. Or let's say, instead of gradualism, we can think the notion of punctuated equilibrium, where let's say there are moments of stability, but then pandemic, wars, new mill shutting down in Bombay. These have become clear moments where that equilibrium is disturbed, and you kind of try to hit another equilibrium, so to speak. Not interstitial, but one can think of the notion of interplay of forms and objects. And just to add to the notion of multi-layered, we can think through the notion of sedimentation, but also the notion of transduction, which is basically like introduction of a virus in the body, for instance, changes that person, at least for momentarily, or sometimes if it is an HIV or something like that, for good. So the moment the idea of transduction could also be introduced in this, so to speak, list of concepts that have really have been with us for the last 20 years or so at least. And I think that I will stop my presentation there and invite Ranjana. While Ranjana is prepping her presentation, let me stop my presentation and introduce Ranjana. I'm not able to stop the presentation. Sorry. Okay, so let me quickly introduce Ranjana. Ranjana Dave is a dance practitioner and arts writer. She teaches in the MA performance practice in dance program at Ambedkar University, Delhi, the first practice-based program of its kind in South Asia. She is programs director at the Gati Dance Forum, where she is involved in developing, curating, and documenting various projects, including a new annual journal titled The Body and the Performative. Her writing has appeared in First Post, The Hindu, Scroll, Time Out, NCPA, On Stage, Asian Age, Indian Express, and Tons, among other publications. She's the co-founder of Dance Dialogues, a Mumbai-based initiative that connects the local dance community to provocative and diverse ideas, individuals, and institutions. She has co-curated and curated several contemporary dance events, including Ignite Festival of Contemporary Dance, Serendipity Arts Festival, among others. With that, Ranjana, can I request you to start your presentation? Thank you.
Thanks, Shreyank. I wanted to start actually with the forest that Prasad invoked at the beginning. The moment he said the word forest, I found myself thinking of the way the word forest, the term forest, the forest as a gesture, as an idea, sits alongside multiple meanings in the system of hand gestures followed in classical dance, which we draw from this dramaturgical text called the Abhinaya Darpana, largely. So the moment Prasad said forest, I found myself sort of reciting the verse that lists forest as one of the meanings of the gesture pataka, where it talks about vani. This gesture is used to talk about forests. It's used to say vastu nishedhani, so to sort of refuse objects. It's used to indicate the breast, kuchasthale, to a night, so nishayamcha, again, like even in terms of the movement of it, very similar to forest. Nadyam, so rivers, and Amara Mandali, the galaxy, so there. So, and there's a way in which all these meanings, there are 42 of them actually with the gesture pataka. All these meanings are activated by the same gesture in different configurations. And they're not self-contained, they're really bleeding into one another, both in the cadence of how they're recited, where you say Natya Rambhe, Varivahe, Vane Vastu Nishedhane, Kuchasthale Nishayamcha, Nadyam Amaramandale, all these words bleeding into each other. And also in the ways in which the movement traverses from one seemingly discontinuous concept into another, whether it is a forest refusing an object, breasts, the night, the rivers, the galaxy, and so on. So it's almost this way in which a semantic discontinuity of sorts is being juxtaposed with a physical continuity, where the body is leading you from one gesture to another. So that was something I wanted to bring up with respect to the forest. Also, thank you, Shreyank, for all the ideas you brought into the conversation. Reading the note, the description for this session, and also like historically how sort of the imagination of urbanization has led me to think about the idea of home in the body. So much of what we do as movement practitioners is geared towards that, towards finding home in the body. And just as with ways of reading cities, movement practices also take two approaches in terms of how they locate home. There is the approach that most codified forms offer. Codified forms are the forms in which the body is schooled into a way of moving, often by imitating shapes and repeating movement phrases. This could be classical dance or Bollywood or yoga. All of them largely follow the same approach. In these practices, as you repeat shapes and phrases, you are working to build ease in movement, to build a muscle memory of these shapes and phrases. So every time I do this, my body is remembering how to get here. My body is remembering what it means to hold this, or any other such shape or phrase. You're working to replicate forms and systems that exist outside of your body. And in a way, you continue engaging with these forms until your body knows how to replicate them, until it's almost your body's primary urge to organize itself in these forms. But similar to cities, bodies resist this organization. They grow, they get injured, they feel tired, they age, and they refuse to find consistent alignment with this sense of home. Home is precarious. It keeps shifting. It's not an end point, but really a process. And in these codified practices, in their sureness, in their focus on perfection and full and complete reproducibility, often don't recognize this fact about home, about the idea of home. Codified systems are designed to impose order, to align the body, and most importantly, to almost trick us into thinking that once order is imposed, it is immortal. But from within the scaffolding of that order, the body is really constantly seeping out, it's leaking out. And I feel a certain sense of irony talking about seepage, sitting next to a wall that's full of the signs of seepage. As an aside. So a few more things. What might ways of doing and moving that acknowledge both these cartographies of order and the relative instability of the body within these cartographies look like? I want to talk about two conceptual understandings, both borrowed. The first is Navteej Johar's idea of finding desh in the body. Navteej Johar is a choreographer and dancer. Navteej, when he talks about the idea of desh, desh is not so much a place as it is a sensation. Desh is a term he borrows from Hindi, from the idea of home, destination, country. Somewhere it sort of bridges all these terms in how he invokes it. So as I was saying, desh is not so much a place as it is a sensation, or rather the root of a sensation. It is a form of order. It is a way of making sense of things. But unlike the idea of home in the codified practice, where the body is constantly striving to reach home in this sort of unidirectional sort of way, with desh, there is a two-way transmission. Desh is arriving at a sensation, but desh is also originating from a sensation to go elsewhere. So desh gives you a way in and a way out. It might be a place you stay in occasionally thinking, oh, this feels really good. I like this. But it is not absolute. You come to Desh knowing that you will leave. And the biggest point of being in Desh, of finding Desh, it's actually finding it. It's not really being in Desh. It's not really sitting with the sense of it and saying, oh, I found Desh, I'm happy for myself and this will remain forever. But really that process of finding it and leaving it again and again to find it again and again. So in a sense, Desh acknowledges the idea of home as a precarious construct. The second understanding is a phrase that has, again, that I borrow from Padmini Chettur, another choreographer and dancer. What she calls finding my own standing. We take the relationship of the body to the earth for granted from our social and cultural assumptions of productivity and usefulness. And in the sort of very ableist ways in which order is imposed on the city or on any sort of space. In a way, the certainty in the body begins to stand in for broader ideas of self. Like when we use the phrase apne पैरों पर खड़ा होना, standing on one's own feet, as a metaphor for independence and agency. So what would it take to inflect this idea of self, this idea of certainty, with the actual uncertainty of the body? How can apne पैरों पर खड़ा होना change with every moment, where the emphasis, the labor, is not so much in the stability of standing itself, but really in the process of constantly having to find that standing. Behind the scenes, the body is churning to maintain standing, to maintain stillness or order of any sort. And I'm interested in conceptual understandings that acknowledge the simultaneity of these systems and their leakiness. How are we doing in terms of time? Shreyank?
We are fine.
Okay. Then
you
I'll
need
just...
a few more minutes?
Yeah, I need
sure.
5 more minutes. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, 5 to 7 perhaps. Okay, so I just want to talk about from 2000 about Stop, Look, Go, this sort of intervention we tried out at traffic lights in Bombay. A little context, from 2011 to 15, I ran something called Dance Dialogues, which was really just a way of beginning to have conversations around dance practice outside of the moment of performance. Given the way Bombay was organized and in terms of the demands it made on people's time, whether it was to travel to an event or consider whether participating in a certain project was profitable and would pay the rent, just the idea of meeting just to chat, to do nothing specifically without necessarily arriving at a definite result was a hard one to arrive at, both before Dance Dialogues existed and during its lifetime. That's something we struggled while Dance Dialogues ran while Dance Dialogues ran as well. So in 2015, we tried something called Stop, Look, Go at traffic lights and busy intersections in Bombay, mostly in the Juhu, Santa Cruz area, where my collaborator at Dance Dialogues, Avantika Bahel Goyal, I did it with Avantika Bahel Goyal, and she also turned it into a full-length piece for Serendipity in 2018, which she sort of based in Goa. So Stop, Look, Go was designed as a social experiment where both dancers and their audience were being asked to respond to the mutual uncertainty that was created when dancers suddenly broke into movement at a traffic light. And in terms of the script of movement, we were really just working with the idea of the traffic light, but inverting it. So the green, when the traffic was moving, was when the dancers stopped moving. The orange was a moment of preparation in order to be ready to move. And the red was when they took over the space of the street and occupied the path of the traffic. And this understanding that the traffic light is a place of pause is part of this sort of kinesthetic agreement we make with the city, a social contract with space. And when we invert that, it produces new meaning, both for the bodies activating that inversion and for the witnesses or spectators. The biggest question we encountered in conversation with our spectators was why is this happening? You know, people would talk to us, we'd overhear conversations that people were having between themselves about why we were doing this. And also why we were doing this on repeat, because so much like the traffic light is really a place where you get to see the performance of purpose, of intention. Yeah, you stop there only to be able to go somewhere else to get from point A to point B. But here what we were doing was being done on repeat. People were crossing the street, but then crossing right back and going back and forth again and again. And that produced a lot of speculation around why we did what we did. And the point of the intervention in many ways was the unresolvedness of it all. Can we quickly look at that clip?
Yeah, sure. Let me know if the sound is audible. Can you see the?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Thank you. I think we can maybe pause there and move on to Ashok.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ranjana. I'll just quickly introduce Ashok before he starts his presentation. Ashok Supermaran is an architect and a media artist. He's the co-founder of CAMP in Mumbai. His work deals with intersection of human habitat with embedded technology and physical terrain of digital media, amongst many other things, in adopting the view that many new media technologies are not fundamentally new. His projects imagine a what could have been scenario, the disciplines of interactive art, early and pre-cinema, and architecture. Site-related and public forms of mediation are a deep and growing interest in his practice. Ashok's works, along with CAMP, have been exhibited at various national and international events and venues. With that brief introduction, Ashok, I ask you to start the presentation.
Thank you. It was interesting to read one's Wikipedia bio from maybe 13 years ago, which is Splice moment. So in response to the provocation of Shreyank and Prasad and Rupali and other friends to think, to be part of their project and sort of common project of living and thinking and working in urbanism. And as I think in the introduction, we laid out some of the sort of terms on which I think in Shreyank's text, especially the desire to have the non-cartographic reading, the insufficiency of certain concepts, and so on. Right? So my sort of one line, in some ways, agenda today is to I think encourage us to not fall for a term such as instrumentalization, right? And I'm saying that there is a forest of different kinds of abstractions, right? Or ways that what you've been calling objects and theories and people interact, right? And I am hesitant to dismiss some of those as instrumental, including maps themselves, right? So I'm willing to open every box. I'm willing to say we should analyze in great detail the forms of what we call and in some ways dismiss as instrumental, because they have some power in the world and they act in the world in a particular way, and how they may evolve in the future is not given. It's up to us. So it's also a matter of, I think, recognizing, acknowledging some of these new and old presences. I'm calling them for the purpose of today abstractions among us. And let me give a couple of examples. So in the near a studio where Ranjana used to park her scooter when she used to come to camp, was a nice warehouse called Karmali Film Cine Equipment, right? It was a storage for the production of other kind of urbanism. Very busy, very huge economy, right? In the last 2 years, this has become Zepto, right? Which is, and this is not sort of straightforward thing, but the transformation is dramatic, right? That there are now hundreds of people who I know from Chuim who are wearing Zepto t-shirts and sitting on scooters, blocking traffic. So there is a kind of strange way in which this 10-minute grocery thing, supported by various kind of VC funding and all kinds of opportunistic things, seems to have some their idea of let's say journey, their notion of what a warehouse is, right? And this idea of consumption and all these things, right? So they seem to work in a limited sense, right? For now, right? There is a transformation that they have. So these kind of things, or the way in which, right, in the same context, all the cable operators move to, providing internet to your house. This sort of abstraction, right? This, if you look at it internally, over the last 10 years, has worked for them. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's a kind of a, if it's a way of reading it as a way that their simplification of the urban tradition, their theory of urbanism, which involves thousands of nodes, right? It's not a simple thing. It works, right? So I'm hesitant to sort of not to think of all these as somehow instrumental, or I'm wanting to engage with all these ideas of instrumentalization, let's say, right? And maybe this is a sort of a techno approach, but I'm happy to adopt that role, at least for today. So I'm saying that in a way, the forest of imagination is a forest of abstractions. These are struggles of abstractions versus abstractions. They will always be incomplete, right? These this theory of urbanism is never going to be, their theory of urbanism is never going to be sufficient. The reality will always overflow it, right? But that doesn't, that's not the point, right? It works up to a certain point, right? It has a function in a way. And we need our own abstractions, right? This is what I'm sort of trying to say, which is also in a way what Ranjana said in a different language, right? But I'm saying that there are ways of evaluating and acting that lead us out of this bind of, concepts and actuality, kind of they're exceeding continuously of theory and so on, by following certain things that and the trajectory and the evolution of these abstractions, right? This is sort of the story. Now, and I also mean abstraction in a little bit in the sense of artwork, that is the concentration of the sacrifice of some things for the concentration of other things, right? And the transmission of something, the harnessing of a capacity, which can evolve. Now, the abstract sort of the movement into abstract art from realism, right? This sort of the power of a single brushstroke that represents bamboo, forest, and so on, which you can deploy, which maybe we can deploy, because if you don't, then you're going to be part of somebody else's abstraction, right? Somebody else's, which is the sort of, let's say, politics. So in the context of, so one sort of extended example of the evolution of some such idea, in the context of Shreyank, your discussion about continuity and non-continuity, right? So there's a friend of ours whose email is continuitygirl@gmail.com, right? She lives in Bangalore. And so this was a joke about something she used to do once, which was to act as a person in charge of continuity on a film set, right? So this means making sure that people on very different days of the week, sometimes days of the year, are wearing the same clothes, have the same shave, and look the same, in order to create a continuity of narrative, right? So the default in this form of practice is everything is discontinuous, right? It will be shot on completely different days, but somehow there is a craftsperson, there are people, there is a giant labor and effort involved to produce a form of continuity through it, right? So continuity is a construction, and this is a kind of a very, let's say, an artificial process, right? And it's maybe the inverse mirror of a spatial process, a spatial sort of experience of continuity, right? So in this sort of virtual and artificial world of cinema, the point is that this allowed for immense creativity, right? Because then you realize that the continuity you are constructing doesn't have to be total, right? You can cut to Switzerland, you can, change your clothes in the middle of the song. So, right, all these, so the abstraction of the cut, right, the simple abstraction, let's say the simplest one in cinema of the edit, was vastly productive, right? It's very, very rich because it leads to all kinds of questions about what that continuity or discontinuity may be. But it's also resolved in the history of cinema very beautifully, let's say, right? So rather than sort of holding our heads ki continuous hai ki nahi hai, people resolved it very beautifully, let's say. They took the opportunity, and the aporia was taken in a beautiful direction, along with a theory of montage, right? So now some sort of evolution of this. So when you have this kind of cut up virtual spliced reality, then of course, as the ground, then there is a lot of people and practices who criticize this, right? There's people like Tarkovsky, classically, like whole film is a single shot, we will not cut, because the cut is born of a certain mode of production in which you have the continuity people, and you have this kind of way of being, right? Or like in Filipino cinema, La Diaz, right? So this idea that we must the duration of the shot is the key to truth in cinema, right? So, and that the subject positions will change completely when the director is not yelling cut, and there are so many other reasons that were given. So the boundary of the film object was reworked. Right? You said, okay, this is not the boundary we want. We want the film object to be like this. So from our case, right, this undoing of the abstraction of the cut was quite important because we saw it as related to the the authority of the author, right, in classical, in say film, which gave birth in some ways to Padma, which is a footage archive which we run for now 12 years, where we undid that abstraction of the cut and we wanted to place this question elsewhere, right? So we said footage undoes the grammar of cinema, but keeps the truth and the beauty of its making, right? In some ways, like we want the film is the film beautiful from the inside, from the way it was made, not only in the way it was presented. So this actually, all this comes from the cut, then, or the anti-cut, right? Then we said, then we noticed, for example, that the abstractions within something, let's say like CCTV systems or security, the gaze of security cameras was very similar to what we were trying to do in, so kind of cinema and CCTV met in a strange way, right? Their abstractions sort of collided and there was an intersection, and that's where a lot of sort of CCTV work started to emerge. And we are talking now about a changed idea of duration, liveness, anticipation, things like this. Now, in quick example, and maybe I'll show just something that, so this undoing of the splice, right, of cinema, which also, by the way, as a form of urbanism, you have all these beautiful examples of like the film Disha, right? Like, so the cut is deployed as a mode of travel between village, Ratnagiri. You can board the bus at night, cut to home, home, cut to work. So there's a spliced urbanism, let's say, right, which is there in the film. That is also a sense of possibility that this can happen. So in Padma, for example, what happens is that, and maybe I'll quickly share one example. I'm doing okay for time.
Yeah.
So an example of what to do with it, right? So we found this sort of long scene. If you can see my thing that we showed as part of our housing stories, which is mostly sort of cut out of this film that was made by P.K. Das and Shabana Azmi about slum housing in Bombay, which shows, and I'm not going to play it. It's a very long scene, but in the center of the situation are P.K. Das and Arvind Agarkar presenting a whole idea of a settlement, of a new settlement to people of Sanjay Gandhi Nagar in Dindoshi. Now it just happens that, and this is very interesting to watch because there are differences between PK's approach, must be planned in this way and so on, and and it's actually a very long sort of sequence in which the film uses a very kind of instrumental bit, right? And we can question what was the reason why it was. Now, the point is that this object sits in a very particular historical trajectory, right? These people were the central characters, the people surrounding, Guruvai, Hamza on the right of Arvind. These people were the people who were the central characters in probably the most famous sort of film on Bombay housing, Hamara Shahar by Patwardhan. And these are the same people who were in 1983, 7 years before this shot, were displaced from Sanjay Gandhi Nagar in Kolaba, right? So in 2019, when Simpreet Singh and me and China encountered these people, then another, say 20 years later, this is in 89, 90, I think the image you're seeing, not 20 years, almost 28 years later, they have just moved into an SRA building in Indonesia. So how did this happen, right? This trajectory of, and this is a very heroic story. It involves film stars and, so how did we end up here? This path is full of objects, right? In your language, let's say. And to archive in this sense just means don't live only in the present, right? I mean, the trajectory of certain things and certain questions, they remain open, right? They are not sort of solved by history, right? They are in fact unsolved. And so we say to people like in TISS and so on, don't go again and again and shoot the same film projects in Dharavi and, interview the same people for the 18th time. Doesn't your curiosity lead you to other times and spaces? And this is sort of also the invitation of something like that. So where you undid the original cut, right, and you opened it out, and that invitation is there for everyone else to sort of engage, right? So, but also now this it has to resist this being just fodder for some kind of machine analysis of cinema, right? Or kind of sort of horizontal learning that machines do, right? So we are also saying that this archive is also a form of taking care of objects in a new form. Like we took the object out of cinema, we pulled its edges, and we preserve and take care of it and write about it in a new form. But we also say that this is not only now subject to a regime of whatever digital sort of harvesting, right? We want to resist that as well, right? So again, that instrumentation will be questioned, right? How do machines read this and so on and so on. So it is again a struggle of, let's say, abstractions, right? To use that word. So to end, so this is a sort of, let's say, a trajectory of a story that started with a very technical abstraction of the ability that you will cut and join something to a whole world of practices and platforms, and right. So I'm saying that you can do similar kind of deep analysis of many kind of abstractions, right? Almost any abstraction that is, networks and Excel sheets and different, like small practices, large practices. Literally every business in Bombay has a theory of the city, right? So that can be analyzed and so on. So I'm saying that for me, this forest is the forest of abstraction. It's also, I mean, for today, it's also the way in which you engage with ideas that are a little bit more than concept. They are ways, they show the path of doing something. And it's an invitation to build an encyclopedia of kind of vast archive, dictionary, whatever you want to call it, a collection of these kinds of abstractions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ashok. It's very wonderful. Thanks, Ranjana, once again. Just to maybe kind of, before we open our conversation, I think what was interesting in terms of how at least both of your presentations aligned or spoke of, let's say, this an interesting idea of how abstractions are constantly being imposed on, let's say, multiple things, including human bodies. And there's always a seepage, always a resistance, always a discarding, this kind of almost a nudging back towards the against those abstractions to move away, which I think was interesting. And the second thing was in the idea of abstraction and in the idea of gesture, there is again very similar things, right? You kind of, like your example of one black line can speak of a bamboo forest, whereas the gestures that Ranjana demonstrated kind of, could open up a cosmos, for instance, or a forest or a river, which I think was an interesting way to also think. And I was thinking, what would it mean to think of, how to think of cities through gestures, and maybe it's a different trajectory altogether to kind of take. But maybe we can open up, let's say, some of the questions that we probably wanted to discuss with one another. And maybe, Ranjana, do you, maybe if I can ask you, do you want to elaborate on the idea of how, I mean, let's say when I was looking up your work, one thing that really caught my attention is that you're interested in this sort of urban history of understanding the lives of courtesans or the tawafs in Delhi. And I found a great overlap with that work with, let's say, whoever wants to call themselves as an urbanist, like Ashok said, everybody's an urbanist. And that's the stance which most of us actually also agree with. But let's say, as long as there is a particular interest and specific interest in reading the city or lives in cities of things of people, I wanted to ask, how does that reading really help you as a practitioner, and vice versa? So,
I think I've always been, it's taken me time to arrive at that understanding, because when my primary training is in Odissi, and I think when I started, and for a long time after, I was very interested in its theatrical manifestation in that moment of performance. But actually, I think also the process of learning it as an adult, because unlike the sort of most common narrative about this sort of journey in classical dance, I did not start as a child, and it was not in my blood or my bones or anything of that sort. So I had to work out that process of seeing what it meant for Odissi to be in my blood and my bones, and that is a lot of work, and a lot of very conscious work. And in that process, you cannot help but notice what it takes to get to that moment of virtuosity or performance. And I think that's definitely sparked an interest in looking at the conditions in which people make work. It has informed a lot of what we did at Dance Dialogues, and also a lot of what I did at Gati later in Delhi, where we weren't that, I mean, the performance was one part of sort of a larger set of things that we were interested in, and larger set of ideas we were interested in. So, and somewhere, I don't know if it, recognizing that in some ways, almost sort of, if anything, it's complicated my relationship with my work, because classical dance is organized in a way where if you ignore what is happening in actuality, what is happening, you can just stay with that system and say this is the forest, and right. And go on and sort of exist within that system and believe fully in that system. But when your sort of belief is split between that system and between how things are actually sort of breaking down in reality, it actually complicates things, because then I have to acknowledge that the way my body moves today isn't the way it was moving 10 years ago, and perfection now. I mean, perfection itself is immaterial as an idea, but what it looks like now is very different from what it looked like even yesterday. So if anything, I think it complicates my relationship with my practice. And that, of course, can sometimes be very frustrating, but also, I mean, that is what makes it interesting and keeps things alive. Yeah.
Right. Maybe linking to that question, maybe Ashok, I wanted to ask, like, do you want to open up how this practice of archiving? I know you touched upon this in your presentation, but like this practice of archiving, you know, footages from like various mediums and various places, and you know, how has that really kind of made you think through this? What one can say, you know, the fissures in the urban processes, no? Like in the sense of this one case that you showed here was this the housing, let's say, history, and that long negotiating process that really takes for something like that housing to really materialize. But there are other works also which actually in the way I was thinking of Padma was also that, you know, these are footages that don't really find themselves in the public attention, so to speak. So they're always in that background. So they're also in some sense not so present. Their presence is not really felt. So you're trying to bring those together in somehow and spline them together in a way. So how does that practice of archiving and putting together things really, you know, work in your practice? And I was just thinking through that. Yeah.
There are lots of different kinds of examples, but I think this one of the starting points is just sort of a fundamental one, that in the beginning it was to archive or to be archived, right? I mean, if you are not archiving, you're going to be archived. So, and that applies to a lot of things. You can algorithm or you can be algorithm, right? Or instrument or you can be instrument. So in that spirit, one starts a certain process with a certain set of beliefs and certain invitation to others. And this is a group sort of activity, right? Now, in relation to the fissures of the so I think there is some such a thing that was like the city after video, like if you want to use a juicy formulation, that there was such a thing as the city after video that happened, and it was how video was changed by the city as well. But it's at that intersection, right, where a lot of different kinds of practices, including performance, right, and including what would have video as part of their language, right, as part of the grammar. This extends today in some ways, except that it's become very sort of Instagrammed and so on, which we don't, right? But the presence of this other material in the air, right? Whenever there's something happening in the city, whether it protest or, you know, in the form of lecture, you know, this idea of documenting and so on, like, you know, this is strange sort of video camera object that is everywhere in the city, right? Suddenly. And so this is the kind of residue or the waste or the constitutive waste, like not waste as a waste, but kind of somehow the material evidence of that period, right? Of a very interesting shift where things were not left unvideoed, right? I mean, not everything, but
yeah.
Right? So it's also a particular period, and it now you come to the point where this becomes very widespread, and it enters the zone of, you know, manipulation and sort of manipulation of video truth, and so we still find that there is a very specific but evolving role of something like the archive in terms of these sudden moments in the city where, you know, it was not about cinema, but it was about handycams and people running around, you know, like at the back of the photography, the performance video that Ranjana showed, like the person behind that camera,
Yeah,
and their subjective position and their ideas and their desires, and so on. So there's this triangulation between subjects in front, camera person who's usually a friend or peer, right?
Right.
So there's this kind of new spatial even relation between technology of a certain kind and new kinds of subjects shooting and new kinds of subjects in front of the camera. Right? So this kind of movement is sort of what was captured, and it's a very special moment, I think, in terms of urban experiences, because it relates to cinema, but then departs from it, right? So this was the kind of space we entered in, and now we are able to at least say that we can dig in that period, like 30-year period, which also you are interestingly describing in terms of your set of theories or transformations, as a kind of digital moment, or all these different moments, and we can sort of dig through this chunk, right, which is not only one necessarily, but we have a sort of workflow, and we have a thinking process, and we have some tools, and we have some abstractions that allow us to engage with this material in a, say, 30-40-year window, as opposed to being in the present. That's one of the.
Yeah, so I was just also thinking maybe.
I had a question for Ranjana.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
No, I was curious because Ranjana worked on some very beautiful footage inside Padma of a sort of, let's say, neoclassical dance being choreographed. It just happened that the guru and the shishya were in Tokyo in an apartment being filmed by a guy called Ashok. And this, so this kind of almost for me, like really crazy sort of idea that you are creating a new classical dance in a living room in Tokyo. Indian classical dance is being produced afresh in 1980 something. So I just wanted to ask her whether for her that has, whether that kind of energy is a one-time thing, it's a one-off, right? Because as you said, that codification processes take over, right? And there's territoriality and all this kind of. So what are the ways in which you, Ranjana, see that kind of invention, right? That energy and that the casualness of that kind of and the intimacy of it. How do you see that going on right now? And whether the classical dance scene is no longer the place where it happens, right? But I was excited by the fact that you could invent a classical canon in Tokyo.
Yeah. So I think, okay, I'm just going to have to move because there is some banging happening on the other side of this room. Yeah, I think in a way this sort of the absoluteness of codification is an abstraction that we choose to believe in, where we're telling ourselves, okay, classical dance was constructed 5,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or so on. Because actually all of classical dance is that scene you just described, someone in an apartment somewhere or a basement somewhere making this work that then becomes a codified form. And those videos in a very interesting way capture both that the fact of it being recorded means it's going to be memorialized in a certain way, but at the same time that recording also allows you to see that it is really being structured and constructed in real time, and in a time that's not that long ago really. I was thinking of something else that I forgot. Yes, so I feel in a way I've been thinking about Instagram as a space where I feel like a lot of what started happening during the pandemic and after, and I mean we've seen it happening in classical dance over the past 10 or 15 years or so in a larger way. When I worked on on that archive as well. In my conversations with classical dancers, especially dancers of an older generation, there was always this resistance around the act of being captured by a camera. And now you see that relationship changing for the next generation of dancers, where actually this recognition that the camera is capturing what they do, and capturing what they do nearly constantly, also allows a casualness to seep in, almost a very sort of productive kind of being flippant. For instance, on Instagram, what I find very interesting is that dancers are able to define themselves as independent entities. The way classical dance is organized, the Guru Shishya Parampara, the teacher-student tradition, is very important. Your teacher dictates the kinds of opportunities you can access, the information you can access, the training you can access. But now on Instagram, you can go, you can look up someone else's challenge and then try to replicate it. You might do something, do a movement to a song just because it's a trend, and that you're subscribing to these different kinds of clubs, but for a very short period of time. You're participating in one challenge, but then you're also sort of posting a 45-minute varnam, and you can very easily sort of transition between these spaces, because the space is casual, because you know that nothing you do really sticks. And while that was for an older generation of dancers, that was a concern, that was a threat in some ways, that nothing you do really sticks, that a record can be played over and over and over again, and it has some sort of impermanence. It distances the body in some ways, because then the body has almost sort of signed off that the act of remembering to the record. But now, with sort of the Instagram generation, and with what we see happening on Instagram, that's actually a useful thing, where because you're only going to be seeing it, I'm going to do something weird and funny. I'm going to post it with this felt cute, might delete later, or I know it's casual, I know it's temporary, and that is what makes it easy to participate in it and also to exit it. Yeah.
So, if I may, we have 10 more minutes. I think maybe I wanted to open up the question of interplay for both of you, which I think I was thinking of, again, one of the performance presentation at camp, which begins with by the CCTV camera turning towards this sort of a plastic ball, and then kind of zooming out onto the neighborhood street corner, and then to Tiger Shroff's window and things like that, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing where I think, once again, the shift is not necessarily on an abstraction of a certain kind or a fixed model, so to speak, but it really introduces agencies of things very specifically, but also playfully in some sense. So, and one can see a similar, let's say, almost, if I may, in a very, let's say, non-insulting way, a zombie-like performance of at the street signal, where the bodies don't really adhere to the norms of, let's say, a kind of a well-behaved body, but they really become, well, the zombies perhaps of the army of the dead. They have intelligence and things like that. And, so in that sense, and where it kind of becomes interesting that things are really at play with one another. They don't necessarily fall into a flux or a process that is really abstracted in that sense. So, and these two things really interested me, and have maybe you would want to elaborate a little bit, Ashok, first, and maybe Ranjana after that.
Yeah. I mean, we've been saying that the capacity of any technology, including body, is much more than its implementation, even in every so-called everyday life, right? I mean, we are in that sense not we are pushing against that idea that that is the status quo, right? Or in any way that's the ground. We are saying that the possibility, right? And here I'm insisting that you write the abstraction a little bit, right? Because without that you don't get the possibility of that sort of generic. I mean, 12 of those on G-Link and there are 3,000 of them. They all have this tilt, zoom, 4K, full cinema, 24-hour cinema, right, type of equipment. Is in stark opposition to the security function, right? So, why not use, as we said in another project, there's a difference between sort of watching the coast as a guard or filming the sea, right? There's a difference. But you need to adopt or you need to exploit the abstraction to make use of that, right? So the reason we are able to tell you the story of Ashok in that particular building water is that there is a 30x zoom on the average camera, right? So it blows, it opens up many of the conventions of sort of cinematic language and so on by being an extreme form of that. So we are interested in that possibility, right? That many of these instrumentations and so on have lots of hidden capacities, and those are to be used to our benefit, right? We have to turn the abstraction away from its destiny. But that's obviously easier said than done. But still, that's and also that's the role of art, and that's the role of that's a specific form of imagination. I think that's interesting. So I think that applies easily to or can apply to the body. It also need not be an active. It can be a refusal to engage with certain parts of the abstraction and so on. But I think that's also the idea that I found it interesting. You had said, I don't know who you quoted, but you said that small things can be generalized, but the reverse is not true, right? Or, I don't know who you were quoting, but at least that
Marx said it.
Sorry, Marx said that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, I believe you. No, I'm saying, so the effort. I mean, I think there is that when you as an artist or when you're talking about a systemic condition like say CCTV, then that intervention that you make is quite key, because you're trying to say that that is a possibility that can be generalized, right? The promise is, or the potential is that, like in our housing story, we are saying that this way of working, I think Manoj also said something like this, you can do this for almost anything, right? It becomes a kind of method, right? The way we are presenting, say, a housing story, or the use of montage as a kind of performative practice, as a kind of live cinema. Like, I can do this anytime. I can do this for you right now, here.
Right.
Like, so that potential is what artworks and artists in our adolescence try to capture. That you can capture that potential at the heart of an abstraction, or the heart of an object, or the heart of something that can that you see can have a general effect. Whether it actually does or not is a separate question. Right. But so we are trying to sort of provoke those kinds of moves right? Which cut at the heart of, let's say, contemporary abstractions, technologies, and their assumptions. So that's the move, that's the form, right? Rather than say set or articulation of a theoretical kind, which I'm not user exclusive. I'm just saying that this is the way. So I'm for adopting the premises of some of the abstractions because of their power.
Right.
Taking them in a
different direction.
This is, I think, actually the challenge, that we cannot do it without the abstraction. We cannot do it sitting in our chairs.
Ranjana, do you want to?
Yes, a short response. When you brought in the idea of interplay, I started thinking about breadth. And a few years ago, I learned a very interesting fact about breadth, at least something that I wasn't aware of earlier, and which really fascinated me. When you breathe in, you're not taking air into the body. I've always assumed that breathing in is taking air into the body, but actually you're making space for air by compressing your organs when you breathe in. And when you breathe out, your body is reclaiming that space by expanding into its fullest self. So somewhere living and being and doing is really a combination of these two things, of making space for air and pushing it back out. And I think a lot of what I've described today and spoken about today, and what I'm hearing from the two of you, is really about this interplay between making space and reclaiming it, and between acknowledging both of these as constant conditions.
I think with that, on that note, we are on mark to kind of, on time to finish this conversation. And like Ashok said, it's best left incomplete probably, because there's more space to kind of improvise and develop these thoughts further. So with that, I would like to thank both of you. Please feel free to join for the rest of the day. Probably, I think it'll go on till 7:30 or 8 in the evening. So as and when possible, but I think we'll take a short break before the next panel starts. And I'd like to thank you both of you again for your time. And I know it takes a lot of effort to gather thoughts and in a short period of time like this. So thank you for your presentations again. Right? See you after the break.
Thank you.
Thank you.